I'm Howard Louthan. I am the director of undergraduate studies here at the University of Minnesota. We're just so pleased to be able to celebrate with all our wonderful students these presentations. And we just want to take a few minutes as well, because this is also somewhat of an awards banquet to at least announce some of our prize winners today as well. So I'm going just to take a few minutes to that, then we can continue to eat, and then we'll have a little bit more time before our next session starts at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to begin today with our Hedley Donovan Awards. Now, the Hedley Donovan Awards are a marvelous prize that the History Department is very fortunate to be able to administer that allows students to do significant research wherever, from here in the Twin Cities to New Zealand, and even further afield. We have this year 4 winners to that, and if you are here when I say your name, please just do stand up so we can acknowledge you together. So we have 4 winners: Talia Magnuson, whom we heard earlier; Charlie Payne, who I think is actually abroad still; Andrew Wagner; and Tyler Zupajic. So you should ask these students about what they're doing, and many of them, well, we heard Talia today, but many of them will be presenting next year as well. We also have an award that recognizes a diversity of perspectives, experiences, and ideas in the History Department. And that's obviously a broad catch-all phrase, but I think our winner this year really is exemplary in that respect, and is going literally to the other side of the world to bring some of those perspectives to that, and that's Hannah Kirosek, who will be talking a little bit later. So Hannah, if you could just stand as well. Now we have a series, excuse me, we have a series of paper prizes of students that have worked on a variety of projects throughout the year, and they submit them, and a committee will evaluate them, and we've wonderful submissions this year. And so I'm going to announce those as well. We've got 4 of them here. The class of 4 of them. The class of 1889 Memorial Prize goes to Jerry Jerabek for Family, Faith, and the Franks, the assassination of Wenceslas I in context. The George D. Green American History Research Prize goes to George Wellick for a beautifully written paper, Woven Lives, Migration, Morality, and the Making of the Wellick Family. The Howard Reinmuth Prize in European History goes to Talia Magnuson once more for her work leveraging masculine fears of domination, Josephine Butler's use of gendered language in government by police. And our 4th prize goes to someone I worked with last year who is not here, but is in Japan, and appropriately enough, this is the Non-Western Paper Prize. That goes to Samson Black for Zainichi leftist and the Japanese Communist Party, nationalism and division in the post-war Japanese communist movement. So, Samson. Now, we, in addition to these traditional forms of historical research, we have a non-paper prize project, and we're very sort of excited about our students here who have worked very hard on this project. Let me first just announce your name. If you could just, if you're here, just stand up, please, and then I'll announce the project. Dory Katz, Reed Campani, Zacharias Khan, Malia Knobloch-Killian, Talia Magnuson once more, and Charlie Payne. These students worked to put together a marvelous poster presentation on Students Speak Out, Histories of Student Activism at the University of Minnesota. And I'm also excited to say that we will have a new exhibit coming up very shortly with Professor Andrew Decro, and that's actually going to open on Monday, and there's going to be an official launch on Wednesday as well. And the Skyway here on the West Bank, if you're able to come, we'd love to see you for that. Now, finally, the last announcement I will have, or the last bit of public recognition I'd have, and again, I'd ask you just when I mention your name, just to stand, and then we'll recognize you all together instead of applause after each individual, is I think it's appropriate that we recognize this history honors cohort, this historical history honors cohort, because you guys are the first ones, and hopefully you'll be back here with grandkids in tow one day and say, I was there for the first time that this went through. Okay, Dory Katz, Carol Atea, Riken Farr, Nat Goodwin, Alexa Haack, Hannah Kirasek, Dylan Lohman, Talia Magnuson, Alex Nelson, Colby Miller, Haley Pavelka, Ainsley Pauna, Matthew Smeaton, Emma Sparks, Nathan White, Nadia Woolner, and Jim Vilchek. So let's give them all a warm round. Okay, thanks very much. We've got about 15 minutes for everybody. Welcome to the session, Literary Visions of Europe and the Wider World, Medieval to Modern. Now, the way we'll run this session, we have an hour for this. Our speakers will go for about 12 minutes. And afterwards, we'll have time for questions all together. So I will introduce all three of our speakers right now. Then we'll move in order. And then we will have time for questions from the audience. So let me introduce our speakers. We're going to begin with Alexa Haack, who is excited to be finishing her degree after a 15-year hiatus. Alexa is an extremely interesting person who she served as a stand-up comic for sometimes, and great stories. I won't go into all of them. She came to my attention in the class I taught a year ago by some really interesting, again, life experiences, and I'm really excited to hear Alexa's presentation here. This project made her fall in love with historical literature, and she plans to pursue a master's degree in library science, but for now, she's focused on buying a house and settling down. Our next speaker will be Colby Miller. Colby is originally from Fargo, North Dakota, and has been studying history with a minor in medieval studies for 4 years. While at the university, Colby has worked at a number of research and archival institutions around the Twin Cities, including the Minnesota Historical Society, with whom the department has a really good relationship, and we're excited always when our students are able to secure internships there. And the Center for Austrian Studies, where he worked, at least indirectly, with me a little bit. After graduating in May, Colby plans to get his master's in library and information sciences. Our third speaker is Nathan White, who has written about 19th century European expeditions to Egypt in relationship to intellectual colonialism. He specialized in contemporary European history and European colonial policy. He started his honors thesis in the fall semester of 2024 and completed it in December 2025. While working on it, he traveled abroad working with the Louvre in Paris, the Museo Egizio in Torino in Italy, and the Egyptian and Papyrus collection in Berlin, Germany. He has continued that travel. There's a real wanderlust there. He's been to 20 different countries as well. So, without any further ado, Alexa will start us off.
Hey everybody, I'm Alexa Haack. Yeah, like Howard said, I was a comedian for a long time, so if I seem like a crazy person for not having notes for a 12-minute presentation, you are both correct and incorrect. Okay. So yeah, my project is on this 14th century novel called The Book of John Mandeville, which you might not have heard of, but that would seem insane to a 14th century person. So, can I?
Should be the left and right arrows. You might have to move your mouse over to the other screen to click on it, so you can do that.
No.
So sorry, it's just an extended screen. So if you pull your mouse over to the right, there you go. click, and then you should be able to move. Lo siento.
Doing a great job already. We're crushing it, folks. I also might just be an idiot. That's like entirely possible.
Guys.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so, big scary wall of text. I'm so sorry. This is the only one of these, and you don't have to worry about all of it. It's okay. The important parts of this 14th century novel, profoundly popular. I wrote down there 250 or so extant manuscripts of a book that's 500 years old. So huge. Compared to, Marco Polo, the guy that we think of as like the travel log guy, we have like 7 to 10 of his manuscripts, 250 Mandeville. Key details here. Okay, Mandeville's not real. The author probably made him up. The author probably didn't travel at all. Probably just had like a really good library, and he was like really good at copy paste. Like my man, copy paste pro. The real things that the Mandeville author adds to these sources is like deep Christianity and like deep hatred of the Jews. I don't know if that's on this slide, but it's critical to the reading of the text. Anyway, that's all we need. We're gonna move on. Big scary wall of text. Okay, this is from a 15th century printing. Because there's so many like weird, let's go back. Book of John Mandeville, half pilgrimage story, half wild adventure tale where we travel around the world and we meet monsters and stuff, and like earthly paradise, the end of the world, that kind of thing. Context given. So, because there's so much like weird adventure stuff in this book, there were a lot of illustrated printings of this immediately after. So this is from an illustrated printing from the 15th century. Okay, another wall of text that doesn't matter. So we talked about the themes in this book: deep Christianity, a surprising tolerance for all kinds of people that Mandeville meets around the world, and also just every evil in the world that could or should be attributed to someone else is instead attributed to the Jews. It's a troubling text. So we're talking about basically how we read the book as 14th century people, and then what the book tells us in that reading. So, what can we believe about the book as a 14th century audience, and what does the book believe about the world? So, just a very small topic, the state of European global knowledge in the 14th century. Okay, but yeah, I gotta crush in like 2,000 years of history here really fast, so buckle in. Historically, the important part is like historically there was some contact between like Western Europe and Asia, at least South and Southeast Asia. And it's important to note that the pre-Mongol conquest in the 12th and 13th century represents sort of a historic low point in contact between Europe and Asia. And a point that my paper tries to make really strongly is that this sort of low information environment necessarily breeds this kind of like jazz playing, if you will, this kind of improvisational world building. But then, yeah, the Mongols open the world, sort of create trade routes in the 13th century. That's when all this traveling fever starts, and Mandeville is sort of a part of that travel log fever. Polo is one of those two. Okay, so how the nature of truth and fiction is hard to get at here, sort of pre-intellectual, pre-scientific revolution. So it's important is there's not necessarily like a distinction between religious and secular knowledge, right? Like all knowledge is religious in that it's like exaltative of God's creation, right? And geography is the same way, right? By describing and drawing the world, we are sort of like exalting God's creation, right? By writing it down. Speaking of maps, this is maybe my favorite medieval object. This is the Hereford map from Hereford, England. This is 15th century, I think. Important to know, Christians in this time like to put east at the top of their maps because Jesus is associated with the rising sun because it like goes away and comes back. All kinds of cool mythical critters in here. This is the kingdom of Prester John, if you know him. And Jerusalem is, of course, always at the center of these maps in that, you know, tricky, squishy medieval map making. Okay, I lied about the wall of text thing. There's another one. So the ways that we assess truth before sort of science are tricky to describe, but here's sort of our big categories. Authority in not the intellectual sense so much as the sort of political, religious sense. John Mandeville notably is a knight. Experience is the literal sense. Have you seen the thing, or have you talked to someone who's an expert and has seen the thing? Mandeville tells us that he traveled over the course of 30 years, the first part of the 14th century. And then reason, ratio is like sort of a giant topic that's hard to condense, but for the purposes of this paper, we're talking about how does this comport with my existing idea of the world. This is sort of the key, I think, to this paper because this is the reverse of sort of how we do science now. And the idea is to continue to create knowledge that fits into the system that we've already built, right? Which is sort of how you get a reification of like Christian and popular myth, right? It has to exist because we have stories about it. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is how we believe about the book. This is what the book believes about the world. And I said before that a lot of this book is cribbing, right? And so the stuff that is changed and added is sort of where we can get at what the author is thinking about the world. The thing that this book is sort of famous for is being sort of tolerant and inclusive of all kinds of like strange cultures, including like cannibalism and people who don't wear clothes and people who worship idols. It has all kinds of time for those people. And it's important to note that he is always relating that stuff back to his experience and a sort of Latin Christianity. He does this with Islam. He does this with all kinds of other religions that he meets. But he's always pointing out, this is like the Eucharist. This is like something we're already doing. So the argument that I'm making is that this tolerance isn't a tolerance so much as it is sort of a flattening. And also, again, cannot stress, this does not apply to Judaism. All of the evil powers of the world are secretly Judaism. Okay. So I think this is actually like a great work of cultural revisionism. The project, the intellectual project, is to, hard to get into Christian universalism. I've already tortured you all with so much philosophy in the last 10 minutes. I cannot force you to get into the details of Christian universalism. But suffice to say, the Mandeville author is interested in making sort of one universal people so that he can justify that universal people being the Christian people. Does that make sense? So by making everyone, assuming that everyone has some version of the Christian message, and then making them all sort of look similar and relate back to a similar set of ideals, then he gets to basically make the whole world Christian in a way that's sort of essential to like missionary colonialism, right? Like, if you believe the whole world is effectively already Christian, then converting them is not really any kind of sin, right? You're basically just fixing what they're already doing. You're just tweaking at the edges. And again, he gets to do this because he has a scapegoat, right? He gets to keep letting everyone else off the hook because he gets to constantly replace any evil that anyone has done with being like, actually, that was the Jews' fault, so we can't. Which is also, you know, troubling, especially given the tumultuous history between Christians and Jews in the medieval period in Europe. Okay, I think that's it. So, more or less. So, in the 14th century view, like, this book is from an authoritative source. It pretends, it claims to have real lived experience, and where it doesn't, it defers to people who do. And it reifies and confirms existing ideas that we have about the world. So it fits all of our criteria for belief. So there's always been an argument about whether or not people believe the Book of John Mandeville. And certainly it's not the Bible. Not everybody reads and believes in everything that happened in this book, but the point that I want to make is that you kind of can't not. If it fits all of your criteria, if it ticks all the boxes, and you don't have another method to identify truth, then you sort of have to. And also, I talked about this a lot on the last slide, but the whole world is essentially, regardless of how strange it is, effectively Christian. And that sort of paves over a lot of the like interest and diversity in the world that this book is like sort of pretending it's trying to describe. Anyway, thank you so much.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Colby, and my thesis discusses the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century. So for those unfamiliar with Poland during this period, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a state that existed in much of East and Central Europe, so a lot of modern-day Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Western Ukraine. But by the late 1700s, this geographically large state was severely weakened. By the end of 1795, the Polish Commonwealth would be completely removed from the map of Europe as its neighbors Austria, Prussia, and Russia partitioned its territory to add to their own empires. But my thesis does not look at the destruction of the Polish Commonwealth, but rather at the literature that was produced in the 2 decades just prior to this collapse, when intellectuals and authors who were influenced by the wider European Enlightenment created literature and pushed for state reform so they could preserve the Commonwealth and its independence. So in my paper, I argue that these Polish reformists created a unified narrative across both their political and their literary works, in which they villainized new groups whom they perceived to be enemies of Poland and of the reform movement. The primary targets of their hostility were foreign powers and the wealthy nobility within Poland itself. And strikingly, this narrative avoids attacking the king, who historically in Poland was seen as the main opponent to freedom. Now, scholars of this period often discuss political authors and documents in pretty great depth, but not nearly often as discussed are other types of literary works, things like novels and plays and poetry. Yet these things were inherently political, even if it might not seem so on the surface level. This focus on creative literature, specifically, and the political ideas within it, is a big part of what I write about in my thesis. So, therefore, I pull both from political authors, Hugo Kołłątaj and Stanisław Staszic mainly, and I compare the political ideas in their work to literary authors, chief among them being Ignacy Kosicki. Now, there are three kind of big things to know about Poland during the 18th century in order to understand the political and cultural environment in which this literature was being produced. The first is to know about the Szlachta. The Szlachta were basically equivalent to a noble class, but with some key differences to how the nobility worked elsewhere in Europe. So they were the primary landowners in Poland, like nobility elsewhere, but they were incredibly economically unequal within that class. So the wealthiest of the Szlachta, who were called magnates, may have owned thousands of villages and hundreds of acreages and were, immensely wealthy, whereas the poorest may have lived worse off than a peasant. But the Szlachta as a class were also politically very influential. As a group, they held more power than the relatively weak Polish king. And it is from this class of people that the authors of, especially the authors that I looked at, came from. The second big thing to know is that by the mid-1700s, when this literature was being produced, the Polish Commonwealth was the government was very dysfunctional. So the Szlachta, and particularly the wealthy magnates, were gaining more and more power within the system, and foreign powers were increasingly intervening in Polish politics. Lastly, Enlightenment ideas of rational government were also taking hold in Poland during this period, and contributed to a political and cultural movement in which many recognized the need to reform society and the state. So, what does the literature actually tell us? What narrative were these reformists creating? It's clear in the texts that I've analyzed that the narrative emphasizes two principal threats, that of the foreign powers, or the neighboring powers to Poland, and the magnates, so those wealthy nobles. Across much of the literature, Poland's neighbors are portrayed as natural enemies. So for example, in the Mausiad, which is an epic poem from the 1770s, the relationship between Poles and foreigners is represented as a conflict between mice and cats, which, two animals which are kind of the epitome of a predator-prey relationship. Reformist literature also consistently characterizes foreign powers as very corrupt, greedy, opulent, and reformist literature, I mixed up stuff there. Back to foreign powers. They consistently characterize the foreign powers as restricting Polish sovereignty, is what I should have said. And they express a fear of foreign domination through themes of slavery and oppression. All right, now the magnates, what I was talking about earlier. The magnates were equally, if not even more, fiercely denounced as these opponents to reform who basically were kind of roadblocks to the status quo, which benefited them and, from the reformists' point of view, threatened the nation. So, like I mistakenly said earlier, the magnates were characterized as these corrupt people who were very opulent. But they also, or some works go as far as to demonstrate that the magnates are actually losing their Polish identity and becoming foreigners, which of course amplifies their negative portrayal by tying them back to a group that is already hated in these same groups, the same literature. So for example, in a political treatise, Warnings for Poland from 1790, there is a pretty famous diatribe against these magnates, this long list of accusations, blaming them for everything that was wrong with Poland during this period. So ultimately, this literature works to thoroughly separate the magnates from the rest of the Szlachta, these writers, kind of pushing all responsibility for government dysfunction onto this wealthiest portion of the nobility. But a question I kept asking myself when I was reading through all of these texts is, where is the king in all of this? Because, like I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, historically the king was considered as the primary threat by the nobles against their freedoms. The position of the monarch, though, in Poland was much weaker than in other European countries, though it was not altogether powerless. And there are some smaller sections of the literature that does condemn monarchy as a form of government, but they're more specifically condemning absolutism or despotism, and none of them say anything negative about the king himself during this period. So in the Mouseade, which is that epic poem I mentioned earlier about mice and cats, that one actually has a kind of eternal freedom-touting king that kind of acts as its protagonist. And all of this is incredibly interesting because the Polish king during this period had big ties to Russia and was himself from a magnate family, and a relatively powerful one at that. So why this absence of the king in the literature? I think the biggest reason was because of the king's own positive attitudes toward reform. Were another king who was less inclined to the kind of Republican Enlightenment thought and more prone to the absolutist tendencies of like neighboring states, Frederick the Great, people like him. I can see reformists putting a lot more effort into villainizing the monarchy, but regardless, the monarchy definitely takes, at the very least, a backseat to other perceived enemies in this literature. Now, I also looked at the writings of an anti-reform noble from this period by the name of Jędrzej Kitowicz, and I did this in order to help distinguish and define the reformist viewpoint, while also clarifying any common ground that there might be between the two ideologies. And in comparison to reformist texts, Kitowicz's work does express a similar antipathy toward the magnates. However, this is kind of where similarities start and end, because foreign powers are altogether absent from his work. And the king, Stanisław II, was altogether loathed. So reformist attacks on foreign powers and their kind of the absence or even praise of the king in their work is definitely distinctive of their own literature. So what can we conclude from all of this? Reformist literature, no matter its expressed political or declared level of political expression, contained ideas about the nation and about its perceived enemies. By taking a deeper look at the literature from this period that these reformists produced, a recognizable narrative villainizing certain groups is apparent throughout. And united as this narrative is across literary styles, across novels, political treatises, poetry, it demonstrates that all types of literature are incredibly important to understanding the fears and frustrations of reformist authors, and that creative literature is not often given the time that it is properly due when it comes to its level of political expression. Ultimately, recognizing the importance of all types of literature in the construction and perpetuation of a political narrative allows a greater understanding of a group's perceptions, its fears, and its anxieties. Thank you.
Spoiler alert. Oh.
Oh, sorry, was that the end?
Yeah, it was the end. Yeah, there you
Oh, and we're done. Okay. Have you been? Okie doke, folks.
everyone. My name is Nate. I'll be talking about the 19th century Egyptomania movement, and more specifically, examining it through a colonial lens. So what exactly was this movement? Well, among the many cultural movements that existed during the 19th century, this one I find the most interesting, primarily because it combined Egyptian motifs along with existing European cultural forms, such as art, sculpture, architecture, literature. It was a way of harkening back to a simpler, more sublime time in history. And this also was included with the neoclassical revolution that was going on at the time, which sought to honor Greek and Roman traditions in modern Europe. So what was the catalyst that started this fascination? Because Europeans were already well familiar with Egypt during this time. They're well of its importance for its civilization. So what started this movement? Well, the main thing that kickstarted it was Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, which started in May 1798 and lasted until about August 1801. Now, at this time, Egypt was used as a mainland trade route to access the Red Sea. It was primarily used by the British as a way to access trade with India. Napoleon believed that if he was able to cut off British trade to India by taking Egypt, he would not only gain the upper hand over his colonial rivals, but simultaneously gain access to an important geographical location, as well as gaining access to important historical artifacts within the region. This was a common thing that he did at the time. He did this during his Italian campaign, was stealing Italian frescoes, because he believed that possessing cultural forms and cultural antiquity was another form of power. Now, needless to say, this expedition was a complete failure militarily. The French forces were ill-equipped to deal with the Egyptian desert. What it did result in was the uncovering of vast amounts of Egyptian antiquity, chief among these discoveries being the Rosetta Stone, which allowed Europeans to properly translate Egyptian hieroglyphics and gain more access to information. Now, it's important to note that this wasn't the only factor that led to Egyptian fascination within Europe. Other factors, such as the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, shook Europe into a state of chaos, and the idea of returning to a simpler, more sublime time in history was very appealing to a lot of intellectuals. In addition to this, the 18th century ideas of secularism and furthering knowledge heavily influenced Europeans to try to figure out more about Egyptian history. Thus, many European powers started financing Egyptian expeditions to try to get back Egyptian antiquity and learn more about it. Now, despite most people viewing this as strictly a cultural revolution, I argue that it was deeply colonial. And the fact that the 19th century Egyptomania movement was not solely intellectual, simultaneously nationalistic, and a colonial movement to further the national goals of both Britain, France, and Germany. Now, I'll be going over all of these countries individually to see how they used Egypt for their own means. So, first is Britain, and I'll be asking these questions throughout my presentation. I think it's the best way to better understand this. So the first question is, how was Egypt and its antiquity the key to solidifying the British Empire? Now, the British Empire had a very specific relationship with Egypt, and they wanted Egypt very desperately. This was primarily due to the Suez Canal and continual trade with India. As I stated before, it was already used as a mainland trade route, and the idea of building a canal through the Sinai to properly access their eastern territories was very appealing. And it's also reasonable that the British swindled a lot of the Egyptian elites and the royal family at the time out of a lot of their shares, which allowed them to gain complete control over the Suez Canal, which would eventually be challenged much later. The idea of having Egypt as an important part to trade with their empire was key to their expansion. In addition to this, with the growth of the British Empire, there was a need to have a central area. After the Napoleonic Wars, not only did the British gain a lot of important territories and new colonies after defeating the French, but they also inherited a large amount of debt. And in order to help get back a lot of this debt, they saw colonial wealth, and using their colonies to get money was a proper way to do this. Thus, Egypt, due to its important geographical location, being the crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe, as well as having rich commodities like cotton, made it a prime candidate to be a part of their empire and solidify it. So how exactly did they get Egypt in the first place? Well, a lot of it comes down to Oriental despotism and what the British claimed was the right of ownership over Egypt. Now, at this time, Egypt was more or less an Ottoman puppet state. While they had been a part of the Ottoman Empire for a long period of time, the Ottoman Empire was weakening its power, and Egypt was under the rule of the Pasha royal family, who were strictly loyal to the sultans. Now, as a way to undermine the Pasha authority, the British started spreading rumors or making the Pashas seem like tyrants, seem like they were unfit to rule a colony of such geographical and cultural importance, and that it should be in the hands of a more enlightened and a more trustworthy colonial power. Now, they undermined Pasha authority for a long time, backed a lot of native Egyptian revolts, and this eventually culminated to a large nationalistic revolt in 1879. And you'd think that after revolting, the native Egyptians would get their independence, right? Well, a big thing with the British is making promises that they can't keep, so naturally, they took ownership over Egypt in 1882 and made it a protectorate. And this same policy was used towards Egypt's antiquity. They believed that Egypt was unequipped to handle important cultural artifacts that were the cradle of civilization. Thus, they brought a lot of these artifacts that they found back to Europe, back to Britain, as a way to not only display their expansion of their colonial empire, but to say that they were the rightful owners of these artifacts because they were more trusting and more caring than the native Egyptians. This was the perspective of two British explorers that I analyzed in my paper, one of them being Giovanni Belzoni, who was an Italian explorer financed by the British, as well as William Flinders Petrie, who led very important expeditions in the late 19th century. In many of their reports, they wrote about how ill-equipped the native Egyptians were, how they were lazy, they didn't know what they had about the important antiquity within their lands, and they believed that the British would be able to do better with these objects in preserving its knowledge than its own country. Next is France. So how was Egypt antiquity used as a source of legitimacy for French intellectualism, and more importantly, during the Bourbon Restoration? So an important thing to note with France is that they were in a very chaotic state. Following the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, they tried to start a democratic republic, but it completely fell flat, and they were back where they started with the Bourbon Restoration. So, the Bourbons had two major goals when it came to restoring France as a major colonial power. First was to restore France's intellectual integrity by bringing about a new wave of French Enlightenment that had preceded it during the late 18th century, as well as they had to find a new source of legitimacy for their new monarchy that wasn't just the divine right of kings. Because, as they learned from the execution of Louis XVI, that doesn't always work 100% of the time. So, they decided to look to Egypt as a way to restore both their cultural and their intellectual legitimacy. Thus, they continued the French Enlightenment by funding several expeditions to Egypt to bring antiquity back to France as a way to showcase that they were still intellectually capable and still aware of the importance of history. This included the Bourbon monarchs, primarily under Charles X, creating the Louvre's Department of Egyptian Antiquity in 1826, as well as in 1836, the Luxor obelisk was a gift from Muhammad Ali Pasha to the Bourbon monarchs as a show of goodwill and Franco-Egyptian relations. So by doing both of these things and establishing a closer connection to Egypt, they were able to restore the legitimacy following the times of tribulation and chaos that fell after it. Now, several expeditions that I looked at, the most important were ones by Jean-François Champollion and Auguste Marit. Both of them were incredibly loyal to the Bourbon monarchs, while as for Marit, he was more loyal to the Third Republic that was in existence at this time. And it's also important to note that the Second and Third Republics continued this connection with Egypt as a source of legitimacy. Being new forms of government, they had to show that they were still funding culturally relevant programs and that they were not just looking to boss their citizens around and providing services for people. So under a lot of the correspondences between Jean-François Champollion and the Bourbon monarch, he stressed that he was still very loyal to them and he's bringing artifacts back to Britain, as a way to restore the legitimacy of France and make it a more important cultural institution. As for Auguste Marit, he was actually the lead curator of the Louvre's Egyptian departments, so obviously he had loyalties to the French government and sought to return Egyptian antiquity back to France. Now, it's important to note that both of these explorers did not really care about the Egyptians all that much. They were more focused about getting artifacts from them or using them as forced labor to bring it back to France because they were the ones that were hurting and they were the ones that needed this antiquity, not the native Egyptians. Finally, we jump to Germany. So, the main question with Germany is how did Egyptian antiquity contribute to their ultimate achievements of the 19th century, German unification, 1871? Now, this is a big issue and a big concept, so I'll try to simplify it in as little time as possible. So, the ultimate goal of the German Confederation was to unify into one larger form. The only problem is they couldn't really agree on who was going to be the leading states and who was going to be making all the decisions. So Prussia, which was the largest and most military powerful of these German confederates, decided to unite it by using Egyptian antiquity and transforming Berlin into a cultural uniform. So they funded construction projects like Museum Islands to extend and bring the German Empire up to fold with some of their rivals like Austria and the Bavarian Republic. And by doing this, and through many of the explorers, ones by Karl Friedrich Philippus, through nationalist propaganda such as planting the Prussian flag on top of the Great Pyramid of Giza, as well as Ludwig Borscht, who had pictures of Prince Johann Georg of Saxony with a Nefertiti bust, showed that Germany was on the same level as their cultural superiors by funding these projects. So why does this all matter? You've heard me talk about constant Egyptian expeditions that happened hundreds of years ago. Why is it still relevant today? Well, many of these artifacts still remain within the holdings of European collections. It's important that these be returned to their rightful place and acknowledge that Egyptian antiquity is not a tool to get what you want or fund your projects. They are cultural pieces that matter to a colony, and not to a colony, to a civilization and a people, and should be rightly returned, and they are not novelty pieces. Thank you.
Presenters for their admirable discipline and staying in their time constraints, which allows us, we have another session right at 3, so we need to continue to move promptly, but we have plenty of time for questions. From the Middle Ages to the 19th century Arab nationalism, a lot here to think about. There are also some sort of common themes as well, perhaps the notion of colonialism sort of writ large, from the colonialism of the imagination, perhaps, of John Mandeville, to Poles trying to last-ditch effort to push off sort of Russian colonialism in some respects, to Nate's presentation about Egyptomania. But much to think about, much to talk. So questions? Helena.
I'm Helena. I've advised some of these students, so I'm very pleased to hear these incredible and inspiring projects, and how much I've learned today is really quite something. So I have a question that I could have asked earlier, but that I'm going to ask now. So it applies almost to everyone, but maybe the 3 of you can respond first. The question about translation and about sources. There's obviously, it comes to mind immediately with Colby's project, are these Polish texts? Did you read them? And how do you deal with the translation of those primary sources into English? That's a sort of very specific example. But perhaps also more broadly, the translation across time periods from early Roman documents to modernity rendered in English poses certain challenges, and across worldviews. I think, Alexa, your project on the 14th century, a kind of a language of myth and religion, beginning to think about something more universal. How do you translate this into our text now? Which I guess I'm asking about the challenge, to comment on the challenge of translation.
I mean, yeah, I can start. Yeah, because my Polish is very rudimentary. So finding sources that are in English for me was a little bit of a struggle to begin with. But luckily, with what I was looking at, these sources that I was looking at, these authors were the big authors of the period. So they are kind of like leading the way with all of these reformist ideas. Of course, I would love to be able to speak more Polish and look at some of these lesser-known authors and see how their ideas match up with the big 3 or 4 that I looked at. But yeah, translation is definitely a struggle.
And I think with Mandeville, there's so many manuscripts, there's so many different translations in the Middle Ages, originally published in French and then quickly translated into like the Middle English of the 14th century, two languages that I don't really have a command over. But because it's been this is a deep conversation in the Mandeville literature about which translators are making which motivated decisions about how to translate, what things to include and not include. I just didn't have time. This was absolutely something I thought about because the sort of translation and versioning of this text is a huge part of how we talk about its reception in the Middle Ages, but there's just only so much paper, you know?
Yeah, for my sources, I speak both English and French, so I was able to deal with those sources in their native language. As for the German sources, my German is not very good, and I can't really read it too great. But thankfully, a lot of the archives I work with, specifically the Berlin Egyptian collection and papyrus, had a lot of English translations of the correspondences between Lepsius and other explorers. So using my resources and things available really helped me in my project.
Sure. I got, I guess, two for Alexa and one for Nate. So for Alexa, regarding the Book of John Mandeville, do you think there's any influence from Dante on that text? And then also, what does he say about Muslims if he has such like horrible things to say about Jews? And then I just for Nate.
I mean, like, oh, sorry.
Oh, just one last thing for Nate. Where do you think the place of like America is in the story? Because I know that some artifacts from Egypt did enter their way in America. Either one.
I don't know about Dante. The sort of actual religious and philosophical stuff in the book is pretty light. What is pretty common is the like call to Christian unity. And with Islam, he does the same thing that he does with a lot of religions where he says, oh, well, they acknowledge that Jesus was like a prophet, so they're kind of there anyway, and they have a reverence for Mary, so that kind of counts. He's doing a lot of that kind of counts for us anyway, right? Like, we can chalk that one up to us. Sort of how he manages all the religions that he comes across.
I suppose with America's involvement, they were very late to the game in terms of giving Egyptian antiquity, probably because during the 19th century they were not really in the best state to start funding these expeditions, given the Civil War, but they did start funding some expeditions and getting loans from Egyptian collections during the 1920s, and they were more about portraying a sense of whiteness towards Egypt than actually kind of giving antiquity.
I actually have a quick question for you, Nate. I was interested about your inclusion of Petrie in your sources, given that, I mean, he was born kind of on the tail end of Egyptomania, and he was more, I think, involved in, like, especially in the archaeological space of, like, kind of training the next generation of, like, kind of neo-colonial influencers in the Middle East. Like, he was the archaeological trainer for Gertrude Bell in her work in Iraq, right? Yeah. So, like, what made you include him in your kind of collection of...
He did a lot of later expeditions to Egypt, primarily during the 1870s, by the time that Britain kind of had control over Egypt. So by both looking at Giovanni Belzoni's report, which was during the 1820s, a very early Egyptian expedition by the British, as well as a much later expedition under Petrie, I was able to see how relations or how interpretations of Egypt changed over the span of time.
Questions? Yes, in the back.
Oh, Anna's got one too when you're done.
Oh, Anna, I'm sorry.
I'll stand. I'm Anna Clark from the History Department, and a question for Nate. And Nate's in my imperialism class. We knew all this stuff before. But we saw this movie, Dahomey, about the return of the Benin statues of kings that were seized by the French in 1895. But they're really power objects. It made me think of the talk about the Caesars and destroying the statues of Caesars. But with these Egyptian power objects, what did that do to them to be like put in European museums? And did you see any echoes with that?
There wasn't as much as a religious affiliation with these objects like in the film, but they definitely felt that they were losing their culture, and the fact that they were already under the thumb of British authority and they had to endure a lot of hardships under the British. The fact that they lost their culture and a lot of their very important objects definitely bothered them. It still bothers them to this day.
Okay, we have a whole bunch, but there's some over, let's go to the far side of the room.
So there's
Stand
up,
up and
please.
speak up.
there's throughout the three presentations, one of the themes I noticed and I found quite interesting was kind of the
Hold on 1 second, we're gonna bring a mic to you.
oh sorry, yeah, I'm not great at directing, this will be easier. Hi. Yeah,
That's better.
well, that's much better. I was curious to see there's an undercurrent, a potential undercurrent, especially in the work of Mandeville, with the ability of the consumers of information presented, people reading Mandeville's work, or people reading the letters in their historical context at that time when they were written to, and people who would have consumed them and they were intended to be consumed by. I'm interested in current parallels between that pattern of being able to say, especially with Mandeville, how people understand what is truth and how they process what is truth and how they can verify, oh, this is correct information, this is why we believe this book. I see those parallels in all three presentations, but also in modern world with social media and whatnot, and it builds an echo chamber. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how those patterns, especially used by Mandeville, but also throughout all three presentations, how those potentially have relevance today and also reappear throughout time over and over as parts of how people process information, how that drives the official or the commonly accepted narrative.
Okay, so sort of a general question to this entire panel on this broad thing.
So there was an early version of this paper where I did talk about how the sort of reason part of this medieval logic structure is kind of what the algorithmic internet is doing to you all the time, right? It figures out what your existing worldview is and then intentionally feeds you information that already fits into that worldview. Knowing that it will have more truth value given that it fits into your worldview, that should be harder to do now. You would think with like objective, like scientific truth production, but yeah, motivated reasoning is like a powerful thing.
Yeah, I can see when you're talking about different worldviews, that's very prevalent in the work that I look at because it's very polarized, with the reformists and the anti-reformists really going at each other. But I mean, there's a lot of parallels between I think the modern world and the things that the reformists especially were talking about with a fear of intervention in their own political system by foreign states and by their kind of ultra wealthy class. And then of course these reformists were writing literature that was by and large being read by people who sympathized with their worldview. So it's like I said in my presentation, it's perpetuating that worldview, and I think there's a lot of that today, especially with algorithms. Yeah.
I think a big thing within my own project is just understanding how a lot of these Egyptian artifacts and back up a bit, how they were portrayed and how Egyptians themselves were portrayed in these texts. Many of these expeditionary reports were published by large media houses in both Britain, France, and Germany, and during the colonial period, this fascinated a lot of people, and just separating truth and fiction and getting a better understanding and less skewed, broader understanding of how people interact with their history and why history is important to them is key to understand this issue.
Perhaps one more, Ian?
You guys.
Maybe we collect a couple questions. Carol, you have a question. Anne, why don't you say as well? And we'll get these questions out there, but we'll just have to cut the discussion off. That's right.
Oh, and Carol can first.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, and then Carol.
My question's for Nate, and it's kind of twofold. With the expedition reports that you just mentioned, did they really talk about the acquisition of mummies specifically? And even the acquisition of mummies, if that exists in the reports, was there a focus on how some of these were actually just stolen and raided, not through purchases that were obviously very skewed?
Okay, let's collect some questions. Anne, did you have something that you wanted to throw in as well, and then we'll speed answers.
There's actually a very interesting literature on Europeans going to China and collecting treasures. And I guess the short argument is they are successful, but a lot of them aren't stealing things, they are buying things, they're getting them legitimately. There is not, this is mid to late 19th century, there's not yet a conception of nation and national treasure. The national treasures are the imperial treasures. All of that really changes in the 20th century. And I mean, I know you're pretty much finished with this project, it has nothing to do with China, but I can give you references if you'd be interested in comparative perspectives.
All right. Any quick responses, as we'll need to move on to our next panel, to any of these?
To answer Carol's question, yes, there is reports of mummified beings being purchased and exchanged, but many times this was just due to a lot of Egyptian antiquity. It was swayed in a different way, or European collections got a lot of the premier objects, and they left Egyptian departments and Egyptian antiquity collections with very minor, very poor archaeological objects. And also, they didn't take a lot of good care of these mummified objects. In fact, in Belzoni's report, he talks about he was in the tomb of Seti, and he picked up one of these corpses, and it completely turned to dust in his hands. So they didn't really care too much about preserving these corpses that much.
Okay. Let's thank our presenters for